think we can get started in the interest of time. Good day, everybody, recognizing that we're all in different parts of the world. This is a good time to be here. I'm delighted to introduce today's seminar speaker, Mr. Maxwell Gomera, who is the resident representative for the United Nations Development Program in Rwanda. Previously, he was the director for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services branch of the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. He has over 2 decades of experience in biodiversity, wildlife management, social economic development, having worked in different capacities with natural resource management institutions across Africa. Mr. Gomera has been the Deputy Director of the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center, also an Executive Assistant to the United Nations Environmental Program in Nairobi, and Project Manager for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He was on the UN team that produced the Global Green New Deal report that most of you might be familiar with. He's got a natural resource economist master's degree from the University of Western Australia and a BSc degree in agricultural economics from the University of Zimbabwe. I should say here that Maxwell and I were classmates at the University of Zimbabwe. So all the good things I learned in microeconomics, I learned from him. Maxwell, it's a delight to have you speak to us today. We look forward to hearing your remarks. You can also follow him on Twitter on @gomera.m. He's quite active there, so you can continue to follow him after this talk. Maxwell, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And he has told me that he has about 30 minutes of presentation. So please do hold on to your questions. I'm looking forward to a rich and robust discussion from the class after his talk. So over to you, Maxwell from Kigali, Rwanda.
Well, thank you, Ed, for those kind words. I must tell you, I grew a few centimeters taller just listening to you. And, thank you for inviting me to speak to the community at Cornell. It's a great honor, and I'm especially delighted to have this conversation with you. You have great ambassadors around the world, and Cornell has an outstanding reputation. I must say, when I was a lot younger, I harbored some ambition of coming to Cornell. Well, life took me in a different directions, but I'm especially delighted now to be joining you at this stage. The conversation we're going to have today, I've organized it in about 4 blocks. First, I would like to tell you my story and why the issues matter so deeply to me. Second, I would like to have a conversation with you around a measurement problem that I think if we are going to succeed in what we are doing, we ought to overcome it quickly. Third, I would like to draw from my own experiences in Africa and in the countries that I've lived in Africa, and especially the country that I now call home of Rwanda. And I would like to end by just inviting you to share some thoughts around how we can take advantage of the new slate that COVID-19 and the recovery processes that are happening around the world are offering us. How can we build a better society? How can we build back better with what we have right now? So colleagues, even for those of us who are one step removed from nature in our present day lives, looking back on places that we called home as we were children can reveal very disturbing truths. This is certainly true for me. I grew up in a small mining town in Zimbabwe called Kadoma. And as soon as school was out, my parents would bundle me off to Mondoro, a rural area to the south. And there I herded cattle across the quintessential untamed African savanna. I loved being in Mondoro. In its rivers, I learned to swim and to catch fish. And I had my first adolescent crush on a girl in that village. The surrounding forests were lush and teeming with wildlife. The rivers were bountiful and full of fish and fall in the pure African fresh water. I really loved it there. City folks like me went home with our hands full from the gifts of nature. But today, my village in Mondoro is heartbreaking. The lush forests and wildlife are gone, replaced by very dry fields. The river is dry. I now bring my own food and bottled water whenever I visit my village. And worst of all, the people are poor, very poor, and have very few, if any, options for bettering their lives. Now, tragically, the story of my village is now shared by thousands of villages across Africa that are now suffering the worst impacts of climate change, population growth, and now COVID-19. The development choices that we make henceforth are very important for their future, and conversations such as these ones, the ones that we are about to have, could be the difference between them being in the society that we wish for them to be or left out of that society. The good news is that the outcomes that we are seeing today are not inevitable at all. Now, today I would like to go into a conversation with you on some of the emerging nature issues and Africa's economic recovery prospects, drawing mostly from Rwanda. As we seek to jumpstart our economies, we need to enhance our capacity to create wealth without drawing down on stocks. Now, this is an age-old, this is not something new. This is something that we have known for generations. We've known that if we want to develop and develop in a sustainable way, we ought to balance our economic objectives, our social objectives, with what the environment can sustain. The surprising thing is, even though we've known about it, we are still unable to, we haven't cracked it, both for reasons of politics, but also because our intellectual understanding is not yet there. Now, in the run-up to the 2008 global financial crisis, banks took big risks. They were very secure in the knowledge that because they were too large and so large, governments would be forced to bail them out if they began to fail. Bankers committed far more than their banks' own assets and capital, which ordinarily act as a reserve and safety in the case of losses. They operated on the assumption that someone else would save them should the worst come to pass, as indeed it did. But today, we treat nature in much the same fashion. We're drawing down resources without accounting for the economic and social impacts and assuming that someone else will save the day. But there is no safety net for natural resources. We cannot reproduce the diversity of resources we are losing at the scale we are losing them today. And without diversity of nature at scale, we lose the underpinning of all life on Earth, including humanity. Unlike policy responses from the global financial crisis, there is no equivalent bailout mechanism for ecological overshoot and collapse. And that accounts for the problem that I encountered when I went back to my rural area in Mondoro, and some of the challenges that a lot of the countries in Africa today are facing. The problem is that our ways of gauging the economic health and resilience of nations does not account for this possibility at all. And once again, this is not a new problem. And it comes from the way we measure well-being and success. Ordinarily, we do that in our economies by using a metric that wasn't designed for that, and that's gross domestic product. And roughly, we tend to sum up our built capital, roads, dams, buildings, machinery, and equipment, and human capital, knowledge, aptitude, education, and skills, and we use a crude, not so crude to be fair, but we assume that your earnings per year are what you are worth. We sum those things up and they give us GDP. But gross domestic product, the standard, this has been the standard metric for 70 years, wasn't intended to capture what we are trying to use it for. It was intended to capture a single dimension at a single point in time, not to measure sustainability. So for example, generating and selling electricity from coal-fired power stations can increase GDP, but it ignores the accelerated costs of climate change and increased respiratory diseases in those exposed to pollution. GDP measures can indicate, by way of example, that the more fish a nation catches and sells, the better it is doing. But emptying the seas of fish and subsequently suffering irreversible damage to the economy and society is not success at all. In these cases, while GDP goes up, nature is running on a deficit. Now, many countries regularly track their gross domestic product as an indicator of the economic progress that they are making, but they don't track their wealth, the assets such as infrastructure, forests, minerals, and human capital that produce GDP. If you contrast that with what corporates tend to do, they report routinely on both their income and assets to assess their economic health and prospects for the future. Now, this is not a particularly new insight again. What is surprising is that we've not learned from our past experiences. Although I must say we're beginning to crack it, my former colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme are working on a metric that I think holds a lot of promise. What they are doing is that they are, in addition to working with the same capitals that the GDP takes into account, they are introducing a new form of, not a new form of capital, but they are introducing estimates of new form of capital called natural capital. Forests, agriculture, the value of the atmosphere, oceans, ecosystems, subsoils, resources, and they're adding that to social capital, the value that for you and I looking after our children at home, or the value for you spending time talking to other people and preventing mental illnesses. Those are assumed to have a princely sum of 0 in our estimates. And I think the work that our colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme are doing is class leading, and we must pay a little bit more attention to it. I am not at all suggesting that we torpedo GDP. It is a useful metric and one that is likely to be with us for a long time. What I am suggesting is that it needs to be augmented. And I think that the work that my colleagues are doing my former colleagues at UNEP are doing offers an interesting metric. They call this inclusive wealth metric, inclusive wealth index. Now, this metric takes into account, as I said, natural capital and social capital, and it is that kind of important piece of work that requires a lot of academic rigor. Now, let me just give you an example of what's happening globally. In the last reviews that we did, the graph that you're seeing there is showing you the trends in global average wealth composition between 1990 and 2014. The red line at the top is indicating growth in human capital in that period. Human capital grew tremendously during that time. The black line is also increasing, is also showing an increase in built capital, roads, dams, hotels, buildings, infrastructure. They were all increasing. The other line that we are seeing there, the green line, is showing a downward trend. Sadly, that line is natural capital. What this means is that we've been growing all other forms of capital at the expense of natural capital. So we are drawing down on stocks of natural capital and turning these into fine up to a certain level. But what we are beginning to hear now from the likes of Johan Rockstrom at the Stockholm Environment Institute, or from indeed the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is that we are nearing, and in some cases, we have surpassed the limits that nature can sustain. And it is time to change track. And now is probably the time to be thinking about that. Now, I would like to draw you from the example of the country which I now call home, and that is Rwanda. For most people in the Western world, their understanding of Rwanda probably comes from what they have seen in the movies and what they have seen on TV, and the tragic story that happened to Rwanda in 1994. In that year, Rwanda showed us the worst of human excesses. It represented a story of tragic failure of humanity. Within 1 month, in the month of April, about 1 million Rwandans were killed by their compatriots. There was a serious and unacceptable genocide against the Tutsis. The country was at its lowest. But now, the country is showing a remarkable recovery. Now, just to give you a sense of of where the country is and how the country is like right now, Rwanda is actually a very small country in East Africa. It borders Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, and Tanzania. It is in a, to put it mildly, it is in a challenging neighborhood. Now, on its own, it is a very, very small country. And to those who might be familiar with the geography of the United States, it is the size of, probably the size of Maryland. The population density is the highest in Africa at 481 per square kilometer. And over 70% of the entire population is engaged in agriculture, with the majority, 19%, 98% of these being small-scale operators. The amount of arable land in Rwanda is very, very challenging. Because it is a small country, the amount of land available per family, per farmer, is less than a hectare. So there's pressure on increasing land. And what makes it more difficult is that the agriculture is practiced on hilly areas. 90% of domestic cropland is on slopes of about 5 degrees to 55 degrees. This country has a lot of hills. That is why it's called the country of 1,000 hills and 1,000 possibilities. But its story has been remarkable. Rwanda has showed remarkable transition between 1994 and 2019. In 1994, Rwanda was the 4th post. By the end of last year, it was the fastest growing economy at 9.4%. Life expectancy was just under 22 years in 1994. 22 years. Think about that. Today, it's about 69.1 years. Infant mortality went down from 196 per thousand births to 26.5 per thousand births. And GDP has been growing, and today it's about $800. Literacy rate jumped from 57.85 to about 73.2 in 2019. Rwanda is clearly a remarkable African story. And all of this has been down to a very clear understanding by the leadership and a sophisticated understanding of where to take the country and how to take it there. In a strategy that the country released in about a month or two ago, the leadership has been very clear about their vision of the good life and how they would like to move with Rwandans, or how they would like the country to move that. It's been very clear that by 2035, they would like the country to be a middle-income country. And that is going to be achieved by improving the quality of life, sustained food, universal and sustainable, reliable access to water, affordable and sustainable modern energy, smart cities. There are incredible developments around how to develop more smart cities. We, in the United Nations Development Program, we are supporting a program right now to replace gasoline-powered motorbikes with battery-powered motorbikes. And the country is doing just a lot of fascinating projects that will turn the cities of Kigali and others around the country into very smart cities. Transformation for prosperity, increased productivity and competitiveness, while providing jobs, diversified tourism. The country has placed its bets in place in the world. High value IT and technology services, businesses and financial services. Rwanda is now developing what they have called the Rwanda International Finance Center. And that is going to be an interesting finance hub for the continent in their own view. I had a meeting this afternoon with the governor of the Rwanda Central Bank. And we had an interesting conversation around this issue and the plans for the country to grow in a more sustainable way, and to look at how the transformation that's happening in Rwanda can be greener and more sustainable in understanding. And I was impressed by the kind of conversations that we had. But at the same time, about an hour ago, I just came from a meeting with the US ambassador and the Minister of Education here. And some of the statistics, just to give you some of the challenges that the country is facing, some of the statistics that I had there was that over 95% of Rwandan children make it into first grade at school. But over 60% of them are still not able to read by the time they get to third grade. Now, that's a big challenge that the country is trying to deal with, how to improve education within the country. Core shared values, self-determination, self-sufficiency. I have not seen again. Found
Maxwell, we're having a few signal drop issues. Maybe try to do, I'll ask people to turn off their videos so we can hear audio, and we can turn them back at the end of the talk. Go ahead, Maxwell.
Right, thanks. So I was saying, I've not seen a country that is so full of optimism and pride as I'm finding here in Rwanda. Transparency and openness, accountability, those are some of the metrics that the country is pulling forward. And they actually do take this very seriously. Every quarter and hold each other accountable, including citizens demanding accountability from their leaders. And of course, they are very, very eager to play their role as global citizens, as international citizens. We've been engaging with the government around their plans for playing a little. They do take multilateralism, bilateral cooperation, very, very important, and all those. They've been very clear about the economics to achieve the good life. High and sustained economic growth, building on successful foundations, ITC, investments in human capital, as I've said, investments in natural capital development. They've also been very clear about the politics to achieve their good life, visionary leadership, strong governance, and all that. And they have a strong and effective bureaucracy. That is one thing that I found remarkable here. The bureaucracy is very responsive, very strong. Can you hear me, Ed?
We hear you, yes.
Okay, fantastic. And stable national security. This is probably one of the safest countries in the world. They do take issues of security very seriously. And indeed, as they should, because they've placed their bets on tourism. They've placed their bets on many of the sectors that do tend to demand a certain level of security. And just to give you a sense of how Rwanda was performing or has been performing between 1990 and 2014, and the beginnings of the conundrum that I'm talking about. So between 1990 and 2014, as you can see, unlike the global figures that I showed you, human capital has been on the rise in Rwanda. And most of that human capital has, of course, been within the public sector. Produced capital has seen a tremendous increase. And it did so, especially between 2005 and 2010. And this is when the Rwandan government decided to invest a lot more in its protected areas, in developing its infrastructure, hotels, buildings, and all the things that make this country wonderful. At the same time, natural capital has been increasing steadily. Now, this is unlike what we saw on the global averages. Rwanda was actually protecting its natural capital. Rwanda has been protecting its protected areas, its forests, and trying to invest in making its agriculture more productive, trying to protect its wetlands. And if you look at the population employed by type of capital and value, within the human capital sphere, it employs about 29% of the population and contributes about 49% to GDP. Compare that to the produced capital, which employs about 9% of the population and is contributing 18%. Natural capital, the whole areas of the tourism, the wildlife, all those areas, it employs about 61% of the population and contributes about 24.1% to GDP. Now, of course, some of it relates to the people who are engaged in natural farming, agriculture, and because the prices of some of the goods and services that they produce is kept low, their contribution to GDP is quite low. Now, this was the situation before COVID struck. As with any other country, Rwanda has suffered the worst of COVID-19. It has fallen from being one of the fastest growing economies in the world to a country that is struggling just to keep on top of what has happened. The fiscal space that was already tight by 2019 has become even tighter, and the government is not able to protect its gains on human capital, on social capital, on poverty reduction, and yes, on environmental gains. GDP has shrunk 12.4%. All but ICT sectors have decelerated in terms of their growth. And we are seeing one more. Unemployment has risen. Unemployment has risen to about 13%. But if you dig deeper, it is accentuated structural inequalities that the government was beginning to get a handle on. 25% of those people who are newly unemployed are female, 19% are male, 27% are youth. And that inequality is now posing a challenge for the government. If you look much closer at what it has done to the business environment, household expenditure down 2%, government expenditure down 18%, exports down 24%, investments down a whopping 34%. And if you look at GDP performance by sector, all but 2 sectors have crashed. Air transport has gone down 96%. The 4% could probably be accounted for by the fact that there is still some cargo happening. Hotels down 62%, education 67%, construction down 20%. The only 2 sectors that have seen some gains are ICT. ICT is up 33% because we've all gone online everywhere around the world, and Rwanda is no exception. Health has gone up 5%, and that's because we're trying to protect ourselves from this terrible virus. That is the story of Rwanda today. And that is the challenge, that is the conundrum that Rwanda faces. Now, if you look at how the conundrum is coming about, many studies that we've seen do suggest that if you would like to create jobs and you'd like to create jobs faster, you're better off investing your money in agriculture. But we do know that agriculture is in itself an enterprise that, if not well managed, tends to mine the environment. So if you are a policymaker and you're faced with a choice of wanting to create jobs faster, the temptation to want to engage in sectors that will undermine the gains that we have made on natural capital is very high. And this is where institutions such as ourselves are beginning to look into how we can work with the Rwandan government to try and build back a better society and a better economy. But there are challenges. The scope of the problem is very big. And some of the challenges require people like you in the academic world to help us to have a sharper focus on where they should. In my meeting today with the central bank, they were making a plea and saying, look, if you've got any analytical work that have been that are out there that can help us to focus better where we should support, please share them with us. This is a wider call that we are seeing, not just here in Rwanda, but across many African countries. Now is the time for the academic world to start playing a role which will help governments and people such as me within the development sphere to try to focus better. But not just that, as I gave you an example, agriculture is a great multiplier of jobs, but we also that it causes damage to environment, but we still want to eat. So what are the options? How do we balance that? Social protection. We know that there's reduced fiscal space. So what are the options? What do you do? Economics. How do we start developing measures of well-being and measures of wealth that will take us forward without undermining the very basis of our progress? All of these questions tend to suggest to me that our in-tray is growing and we need some answers. We need more thinking around visions of the future. How do we develop that? My colleagues at the United Nations Environment Program conducted that I'm very proud of today is one that was looking at, if you look at a basket of goods that a poor farmer in the rural area or a poor person uses for their day-to-day survival, what are the constituent parts of that? Something they called the GDP of the poor. And the numbers they came up with were remarkable. They found that over 60% of the livelihood options, whether or for poor people, I think this is water, whether that forests and firewood, bushmeat, or whether that is fertile soils. Month on month, the survival of poor dependent growing from nature. What it means is that by not investing in nature, we are actually increasing the structural inequalities that are in our society. How do we help? How do you help to make sure that there is greater understanding around these issues? But we also, how do we account for biodiversity risks and stop destruction of natural habitats? How do we achieve it where we would benefit from more academic investigation and rigor? How about our politics? How do we ensure that nature and wildlife are effective and legitimate land use options? In the continent where I am, every square inch of a national park that you will find on this continent has got a claim of one or the other on it. And that is because of our history of forced evictions. Many of the people who are living on the margins of national parks today, they are exerting a claim on national parks because they were evicted from them. And as a result, they do not regard, some of them do not regard wildlife as a legitimate land use option. How do we resolve that? And how do you help to start thinking about ways which we can make wildlife more effective and legitimate land use options? How do we start to structure new markets that will help people to understand that? About 3 weeks ago, I spent some time in an area called Amayaga here in Rwanda, where we were working with farmers to plant trees on more than, they want to plant about 1,000 hectares in a country where land is at a premium like this. They want to plant about 1,000 hectares to plant trees on it. Now, one of our ambition as UNDP is to try and find ways of ensuring that we just don't plant trees and walk away. How do we ensure that we start thinking of how we can add value, to see that there's additional value from planting trees, whether through carbon markets or any other form of looking at how we can create new forms of revenue? That requires a lot more new thinking and structured markets. Now, our multilateral system is broken. And some of you who are in the United States would be, the system has been under attack from some world leaders. Now, we need to fix that. We know that the multilateral system is probably not working as best as it should, and it needs to be trashed. The problems that we are facing today are of a nature that they cannot be addressed by institutions that jurisdict over a wide geographical area. And that means we strengthen those institutions that can help us to solve our problems as a global community of nations. Whether that is carbon.
We seem to be having
new lessons about how we put together.
Go ahead, we hear you now, please.
Yeah. We are seeing on this continent new ways of working together. Now, solving these issues is urgent. At UNDP, the institution that I now work for, we aim to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities and exclusion, and build resilience. So we want want to work institutions those. Friends, to feed themselves and generate cash income, farmers like those of Rwanda and Mondoro are expanding their crops into wildlands and forests, bringing their families into dangerous conflict with wildlife, while at the same time destroying the forests and fertile soils that support their agricultural bounty. 33 million smallholder farmers remain impoverished. Their yields in some crops are just 20% of global averages.
Oops, another freeze. Maxwell, you seem to be cutting off. Maybe you can turn off your camera and just so we can hear your audio. And we missed this connection just when he was making a punchline. Maxwell, you did cut out there for a minute, so do you mind repeating your last about 30 seconds?
Okay. Did you, I described what we do at UNDP.
Yes, we got that.
You got that, right?
Yes.
So
I think it was just your last 2 sentences.
Yeah. So yeah. And, you know, as I was saying, to feed themselves and generate a lot of cash income, most farmers, like those in my rural area of Mondoro, where my mother used to take me, they're expanding their crops into wildlands and forests, and often bringing themselves into conflict with wildlife, and at the same time destroying the very basis of their agricultural bounty. The sad thing is that this expansion is continuing, with Africa's 33 million smallholders still impoverished. Their yields in some crops just about 20% for averages. COVID-19 has changed everything. It offers us a new slate on which to build future. With your help, we can make the right choices.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maxwell. Please help me thank Mr. Gomera. We now have about 6 minutes or so for Q&A. You know, I would ask that, I see Ain already has a hand up. I will ask people to unmute themselves when before they talk. And let's try to squeeze in as many questions as we can. So go ahead first, Ain. Ain Crambar, do you hear me? I thought your hand was up.
Yeah, I do have a question. So
go ahead.
Thank you, Max, for this really interesting talk about like Rwanda's remarkable growth. It's been held up as an example of economic growth for the continent. And also it's been called, like the path they've taken has been called authoritarian modernism, and kind of similar to the path that Uganda and Ethiopia have taken. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the challenges of human rights, the ongoing challenges, and their impact on agriculture in Rwanda.
All right, let's take a few more. Valentina.
Sorry, I lost you when you said, I wonder if you could talk about something.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wondered if you could talk about a little bit about like human rights versus economic growth in Rwanda and impacts on farming systems.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's get one more question. I don't know if you got that one, Maxwell. This is the conflict, the commenting on democracy, human rights versus environmental issues. Valentina?
Hi, Max. First, I wanted to thank you for coming. That was a very insightful presentation. I typed in my question in the chat in case you just want to reference it later. But you mentioned about the importance of developing human capital and how that could contribute to development with a higher return versus other like agriculture. So I see a phenomenon that many young African students have gone abroad to universities in Europe, like the United States, or even like China through a lot of scholarships. I was wondering what is, the opportunity landscape in Africa for them if they decided to come back after their studies, because that is a very quality, I guess, human capital. And maybe what policies do you think could help Africa to attract more talents? Thank you.
Excellent questions. Maxwell, do you want to address those while I wait for more questions? If you can just raise your hand on the virtual hand, if you have any questions. You can address those two questions first.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you, Maxwell. You can respond to those questions while I'm waiting for and also monitoring the chat.
Okay, all right, good. Opportunities in Africa. Yes, I think that it's great that young Africans are going abroad to develop their intellectual capital and human capital. It's something that we actually promote, and we would like more of it to happen. But we would like young Africans to come back, and coming back, it should not, this country is a very good example of what can happen when you've got a stable democracy, when you've got opportunities that are available. People will come on their own because they are proud to come back and make a contribution. You do not have to make it mandatory. What you just need to do is provide the basis for people to come back. And we are seeing a lot of that. But also as a development organization, we're developing platforms where young Africans are beginning to exchange ideas. Youth Connect, Google it, is one of our a platform that we are promoting, where youth from across Africa are exchanging views about how to develop, but we are also providing them mentorship with where they may want to develop businesses and things like that. So, the opportunities, I must say, in Africa at the moment, they are increasing, and we are seeing very hopeful signs in many countries. Kenya, is another one where, it's on a rise, and it's very, very exciting to see what's happening there. And certainly this country is one of them. Now, in terms of human rights versus environmental issues, yes, of course, it's important to take into account the rights of people who live with wildlife, for example, who may want to engage in a different type of enterprise. And I've seen, this country is respectful of that. People who live with wildlife, poor communities, they are given an opportunity to benefit from that wildlife and to participate. If you go to areas, I've had the opportunity to go into areas around protected areas, and I'm seeing a lot of that. I think that those are some of the areas where, nature and human rights and environment tend to intersect.
Excellent. I will take, there's a question from Gloria and Jesse. I know some people might have to go for class, but we'll take a few more questions and give, so Gloria first and then Jesse.
All right, thanks, Ed. Well, thanks, Max, for presentation. I always enjoy hearing about Rwanda because one of those interesting cases that I wish you could copy and paste in other countries in the global South, but doesn't work like that. But my question is on, I guess, just the monitoring of the indicators for measuring these capitals, because I study these capitals in Haiti, and it's always are we really measuring what we think we're measuring? But also, I'm also, I guess, curious about, is there a continuous evaluation of, I guess, these capitals and how they're being measured? Because while investing in one should lead to other capitals being enhanced, but sometimes the investment, let's say in like financial capital to like, let's say wildlife ecotourism ends up affecting human capital because then it affects people's cattle or like other financial, I guess, ways of making money. But I'm just curious to know if there's like a continuous like evaluation of these capitals within Rwanda and like, you know, just stuff like that. I'm just curious.
All right, thank you. And then JC.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, Max. I also love hearing about Rwanda. It's such an interesting country, just geographically and socially. I was curious if Rwandans are employing traditional ecological or cultural knowledge in helping to expand and preserve the natural capital that you have in the country. I've noticed that being very successful in Nepal with case studies like with community managed forestry, and we also have that in this country with like local conservation of wildlife. So I was wondering if there are any examples or if Rwandans are looking more to traditionally Western styles of natural capital management.
Okay. Hope you got those two questions.
I mean, I was just wondering if
about traditional forms of natural resource management in case studies from Rwanda.
Yeah, or if they're looking more to modern solutions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's have those two.
Can you repeat that?
So I'll repeat the question, Maxwell. This is a question about what you're observing in Rwanda. If communities are utilizing traditional forms of natural resource conservation, or if they are turning to new and modern solutions. If you can share some examples and experiences from Rwanda. Okay.
Okay, that's good. I think I did. The first one I'll try. I don't know if my understanding was correct. You were wondering whether there are advancements in the way we are valuing capital. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, what kind of is it consistent monitoring and evaluating these indicators for certain capitals, and I guess how certain investments are impacting, are they positively or negatively on others? Just curious if there is like a continuous monitoring of these like capitals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a lot of work and that is happening right now. And as I said, if you follow the work that my colleagues at UNEP are doing, they are continuously looking into how do you value natural capital. Now, much of the advanced work has been around water. We've been able to develop water accounts because, partly because water is nicely confined, you can do it and you can create a market around it. It's much more difficult when you're looking at other ecosystem services. I'll give you an example, and that's part of what we have to deal with when we are looking to support politicians in their ambition. Last year, the British government decided that they would want to pay farmers a subsidy, agricultural subsidy, on the basis of how much contribution they are making to public goods. That's fine. They've made a political decision, and they will probably be able to decide politically which public goods they would like to pay farmers for, whether it's a forest or whether it's a river or whether it's, some grasslands. But here comes the problem. How much do you pay a farmer? What is the value of a body of water? What is the value of a forest? What is the value of... So that's where we need to do a lot more work. And there's a lot of work that's happening right now, looking at various methods of valuing forests, ecosystem services, bees, pollination. There's quite a lot of work that's happening there. In terms of examples, I've not been in this country long enough, but yes, I can see that there are a lot of traditional ways of looking after nature that people are still reliant on. And those include traditional methods of farming. And I've seen quite a lot of that. But they're also adopting modern methods. Cattle are very important here. A lot of the cattle I'm seeing, they're important for milk production. And farmers are beginning to look into how do we improve the productivity of the cattle that we have in terms of milk production? And there's a lot of work that's happening around that. So they're trying to improve that side of things. But I've also seen that, not a lot of hunting happens here, and traditionally people don't do that here. So that's also very interesting to see how people continuing with their traditional way of living and looking after resources in that way. But those are choices that they're making. There may be different choices in other countries.
All right. I really wish we had more time, Maxwell, and I also wish we were here physically at Cornell. Would invite you to coffee and meet some of our incredible students who are working in this space. So I know some students have to go to class now, and we're up to the time allocated for the class. I want to thank all of you. I'll ask if people can just unmute their cameras and maybe wave at Maxwell. I'll do a screen capture for him that I'll share with him at the end. Hold on. Excellent. Thank you very much, Maxwell. And those that need to be in touch with Maxwell, you can reach him on Twitter. Thank you all for your time. And there's one announcement about the class. I think there was a question about the assignment. I'll let Professor Terry Tucker explain. There were some people that had some few questions about it.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. A number of people have signed off already, so maybe we can
post it on board. Just
post it on Canvas, but I'll just really quickly say that the paper is really not intended to be a research paper. It's more of a synthesis essay where we ask you to draw on 4 or more of the presentations that you've observed this semester, draw links among those. We're going to be receiving 50-some different essays, and people are going to see the series of presentations and the lessons that they got and the meaning they made from those in 50-some different ways. That's what it is. It's there's not a particular style manual that we go by. We're really more interested in your reflections in the meaning that you make of the seminars that you've participated in this semester. Okay?
All right.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Max. It was great.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Max.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.